Stop what you are doing right now because what just happened between the United States and Canada is not a diplomatic spat, not a trade disagreement, not another round of political theatre you can scroll past. What just happened is the kind of moment that historians circle in red ink, the kind of moment where the ground shifts beneath your feet, and most people don't even feel it until weeks later, when the consequences are already living in their grocery bills, their job market, and the security architecture of an entire continent. Trump threatened Canada not with tariffs alone, not with rhetoric, but with the spectre of military force. And Mark Carney, the man now standing at the helm of Canada, gave a response so measured, so precise, so strategically devastating, that it reportedly left the White House scrambling for a countermove it could not find. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what was said, why it matters, how it changes the rules of North American power, what it means for your prices, your paycheck, and your sense of national security, and where this entire situation is heading, because the next move in this chess match is already being set up, and most people won't see it coming until the drawbridge is already rising. This is not just a story about two leaders. This is a story about a fault line that has been quietly cracking for years. A fault line between the assumption of permanent alliance and the reality of transactional power. And that fault line just ripped open in front of the entire world. Let's go back. Because to understand why Carney's response hit the White House like a circuit breaker cutting power to an entire grid, you have to understand the old rule book, the one that governed US-Canada relations for decades, the one that said certain things were simply never said out loud, the one that treated the border between these two nations as the most civilized boundary in the world. The relationship between the United States and Canada was built on an architecture of mutual benefit so deep and so interwoven that economists used to call it the most integrated bilateral trade relationship in human history. We are talking about roughly $900 billion in annual cross-border trade. We are talking about the Detroit-Windsor corridor, one of the busiest commercial crossings on the planet, where auto parts cross the border multiple times in a single day before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. We are talking about shared defense arrangements, shared intelligence pipelines, shared energy infrastructure, and a border that stretched nearly 9,000 kilometers with, until very recently, an unspoken rule. You do not threaten this. You simply do not. For generations, American presidents leveraged Canada through economic pressure, through tariffs, through negotiation tables where the United States sat with considerably more institutional weight. That was the accepted grammar of the relationship. Canada pushed back. Canada negotiated. Canada sometimes won concessions, but the frame of the conversation was always economic. It was always about trade, percentages and market access and pipeline approvals. The military dimension was reserved for the alliance, NATO, NORAD, the Five Eyes. The military dimension was the one thing you kept out of the bilateral tension because the moment you put it in, you are no longer talking about commerce. You are talking about sovereignty. You are talking about a fundamentally different kind of threat. The old rule was simple: keep the fortress walls between commercial disagreement and military intimidation, because once you knock those walls down, you cannot put them back up. That wall just came down. Something snapped. And the question everyone should be asking is why now? Why did the temperature escalate from trade war to this? The incentives suggest a very specific pressure pattern. Donald Trump, operating from a position of renewed political mandate, has been stress testing the boundaries of what America's neighbors will absorb. The playbook has been consistent. Apply maximum rhetorical and economic pressure. Watch the target flinch. Extract concessions. It worked on various fronts. It has forced renegotiations, shifted diplomatic postures, rattled capitals from Brussels to Ottawa. But Canada presented a specific problem in this playbook. Canada is not just a trading partner. Canada is a geographic and strategic reality. It sits on top of the continental United States. Its Arctic territory is increasingly critical as climate change opens new shipping lanes and as Russia and China expand their polar presence. Its energy resources, its water, its rare earth potential. These are not abstract bargaining chips. These are strategic assets that a 21st century superpower calculates with cold arithmetic. The incentives suggest that the framing of military force, even as a rhetorical gesture, was designed to do one thing: redefine the psychological frame of the negotiation, to move Canada from a partner haggling at a trade table to a smaller nation, calculating existential risk, to turn a commercial dispute into a dominance test. But here is where the calculation appears to have gone wrong, because Mark Carney is not the kind of figure who was ever going to flinch inside that frame. Carney was not a career politician trained in the soft arts of diplomatic evasion. He was a central banker, a man who ran the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, who navigated the 2008 financial crisis, who sat across tables from the most powerful financial institutions on the planet and told them in precise and immovable terms what the numbers actually meant. His entire professional identity was built on the idea that you do not panic, you do not retreat, and you do not let the aggressor define the terms of the exchange. You reframe, you recalculate, and then you respond from a position of structural clarity, not emotional reaction. Picture the scene for a moment: a press conference somewhere in Ottawa, under the flat grey winter light that northern capitals seem to specialize in. Carney standing at a podium, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man who has already run every scenario through his head and arrived at the answer before anyone else in the room. Reporters leaning forward, the question hanging in the air: what does Canada say when the United States raises the possibility of military force? And Carney's response, carefully constructed, architecturally precise, did not just answer the question, it changed the terms on which the question could be asked. The likely content of that response, based on what has been reported, and what the incentives of his position demand, was something along these lines: Canada will not be coerced. Canada's sovereignty is non-negotiable, and any action that threatens Canadian sovereignty will be met with the full force of every economic, diplomatic, and institutional lever. Canada. Specific quote or document name would need to be verified. That message, delivered without raised voice, without theatrical anger, reportedly landed in Washington like a closed circuit. No way out, no room to escalate without paying an enormous and visible cost. Let's look at the receipts, because this is not just about the drama of two men at podiums. The structural leverage behind Carney's response is real, it is measurable, and it is worth understanding beat by beat. First, the energy choke point. Canada supplies approximately 60% of American crude oil imports. The pipeline infrastructure running from Alberta into the American Midwest is not supplementary, it is foundational. The Cushing, Oklahoma storage hub, the pricing benchmark for West Texas Intermediate, is fed substantially by Canadian supply. If Canada were to signal, even theoretically, a reorientation of that energy flow toward Asian markets through expanded Pacific Coast terminal capacity, the arithmetic of American energy security changes overnight. That is not a bluff Canada would pull lightly, but it is also not a bluff the White House can afford to call, because the cost of being wrong is measured in gasoline prices and industrial supply chains across the American interior. The energy card is the heaviest card in Carney's hand, and he did not need to play it explicitly. He only needed the other side to know it existed. Second, the NORAD and Arctic security dimension. Here is the piece that rarely gets discussed in the trade war framing, but is absolutely central to the strategic calculus. Canada is America's Arctic frontier, with Russia accelerating its Arctic military posture, and China investing heavily in northern shipping route influence. The United States needs Canadian territorial cooperation the way a fortress needs its northern wall. You can bully a trading partner. You cannot afford to alienate the nation that is literally standing between your northern border and the emerging theater of 21st century great power competition. The incentives suggest that any genuine military posturing toward Canada would be catastrophic for American Arctic strategy, and that the strategic community inside the Pentagon almost certainly understands this, even if the political messaging from the top floor does not always reflect it. Third, the trade retaliation architecture. Canada and the United States renegotiated CUSMA, the successor to NAFTA, and within that framework, Canada retains significant tools for proportional and targeted retaliation. The previous rounds of tit-for-tat tariffs in the steel and aluminum disputes demonstrated that Canada is willing to use these tools and that Canadian retaliatory targeting is politically sophisticated. Canadian negotiators historically aim their counter-tariffs at goods produced in swing states in congressional districts, where economic pain translates direct into political pressure. That is not accidental. That is a precision instrument, and it means that any American escalation against Canada carries asymmetric domestic political risk for the administration doing the escalating. Now let's talk about the diplomatic multiplication effect. The moment Trump invoked the military dimension, Canada was no longer just responding to the United States. Canada was instantly credentialed on a global stage as a sovereign nation resisting superpower coercion. That changes the room at every multilateral institution where Canada has a seat. The G7, the UN Security Council's non-permanent member table, NATO councils, Commonwealth frameworks, countries that have been quietly absorbing American pressure, some of them American allies, some of them not, watched Carney's response and recalibrated their own calculations. The incentives suggest that several European capitals and potentially a handful of Indo-Pacific partners have already moved to deepen bilateral relationships with Canada as a direct consequence of this moment. Canada just became, against every reasonable prior expectation, a magnet for nations reassessing their dependence on a single superpower relationship. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the domestic political dimension inside Canada itself. Mark Carney understood something that Washington may have underweighted. There is no faster way to unite a Canadian electorate than to point an American military threat at it. Canadian national identity is in many ways defined in distinction from the United States. The quieter neighbor, the more multilateral voice, the country that chose universal healthcare and peacekeeping over exceptionalism and unilateralism. The moment Trump put military force on the table, he handed Carney a unifying national narrative on a silver platter. The political space inside Canada for accommodation, for concession, for any deal that looked like capitulation collapsed overnight. Carney does not just have the legal authority to hold firm. He now has the popular mandate to hold firm, and that changes every subsequent calculation. Zoom out for a moment and take in the full picture. What you are watching is the first credible rupture in the architecture of the North American alliance since its modern form was constructed after World War II. This is not a tariff dispute that gets resolved in a committee room in Geneva. This is not a pipeline argument that gets papered over with a bilateral working group. This is a moment where the operating assumptions of an entire continental relationship have been called into question publicly irrevocably on the record. The world is watching to see whether the rules still hold or whether the fortress of the transatlantic and continental alliance system has a wall that can be knocked down by one sufficiently aggressive actor. That question is now live. What does this mean for you specifically? Because at some point the macro story has to land on your kitchen table, your fuel gauge, your paycheck, and your sense of whether the world you navigate is getting more or less predictable. Start with prices. The US-Canada supply chain is embedded in the cost of almost everything manufactured in North America. The auto industry is the most visible example. A single pickup truck can have components that cross the border 6 or 7 times during production. Any sustained disruption to that supply chain, whether through tariffs, retaliatory measures, or simply the uncertainty that comes when businesses stop making long-term investment decisions because the rules keep changing. Any of that adds cost. And that cost does not stay in the factory. It moves downstream to the dealer lot, to the financing rate, to the used car market, and eventually to the insurance premium and the repair bill. Supply chain anxiety is inflationary. Full stop. Then there is the energy dimension that hits you at the pump. If Canadian oil supply to American refineries becomes politically complicated, the refinery margins in the American Midwest shift. They shift in ways that are not immediately visible on a ticker, but show up 3 to 6 weeks later, at the gas station. You may already be living inside an economy where energy prices are twitchy and sensitive to geopolitical signals. This situation is a geopolitical signal, a loud one. If you work in any sector connected to cross-border trade, automotive, agriculture, lumber, financial services, logistics, the uncertainty premium on your industry just went up. Companies do not cut jobs the day after a political confrontation. They do it 3 months later quietly in a restructuring memo that cites market conditions. But the decision gets made in boardrooms watching headlines like this one. The ground-level risk for working people in trade-exposed sectors is real, and it is moving faster than the political resolution of any of this. And then there is the broader security question, which sounds abstract until it is not. If the relationship between the United States and Canada, two nations sharing a continent, a defense alliance and decades of institutional trust, can be taken to the edge of military language by one administration's decision, then the precedent that establishes affects every alliance relationship. It affects what Japan calculates, what South Korea calculates, what the Baltic states calculate. Security alliances run on the credibility of the commitment. Once you start introducing doubt into that credibility, once the protective relationship starts looking transactional rather than structural, the price of maintaining security everywhere goes up. That cost is ultimately borne by taxpayers and by the populations who absorb the instability of a world with fewer reliable guardrails. Let that sink in. We are not talking about an abstract geopolitical exercise. We are talking about decisions that were made in the last 48 hours that have a direct line to your gas pump, your factory floor, your grocery aisle, and the stability of the institutional architecture that keeps large-scale conflict between nations from becoming a regular feature of the world you live in. So where does this go from here? Because the confrontation did not end with Carney's response. It entered a new phase, and there are at least three plausible trajectories. Scenario A is the managed de-escalation. In this scenario, back-channel diplomatic contact, which almost certainly began within hours of the public exchange, produces a framework for reducing the temperature without either side appearing to back down publicly. Trump gets some form of announcement he can describe as a win, a joint security initiative, a border enforcement agreement, a rhetorical gesture on energy cooperation. Carney accepts that framework because it does not require Canada to formally concede anything on sovereignty, while giving the White House enough cover to redirect attention. This is the most historically common outcome in US-Canada tensions. The public posturing is loud, the private resolution is quiet, the fault line gets paved over at least temporarily. But, and this is critical, it does not disappear. It remains under the pavement, waiting for the next pressure event. Scenario B is the strategic reorientation. In this scenario, Carney's response is not just a single reply, but the opening statement of a deliberate multi-year Canadian foreign policy shift. Canada accelerates its diversification away from American market dependence. Pacific trade agreements get deepened, energy infrastructure toward Asian export markets gets prioritized, European defense and diplomatic partnerships get formalized. Canada begins to function less as America's northern extension, more as an independent middle power with genuine strategic optionality. This scenario is more radical. It takes longer to materialize, and it carries real economic pain for Canada in the transition period, but the incentives for pursuing it, given this moment, are stronger than they have been at any point in the modern era. Scenario C is the one nobody wants to model, and everybody needs to be watching for continued escalation. In this scenario, neither side produces a de-escalation framework that satisfies their respective domestic political constraints. Trump, facing internal pressure to appear strong and unwilling to take the political cost of backing down, visibly escalates again. Another round of tariffs, another rhetorical pressure point, possibly sanctions adjacent economic measures. Carney, locked in by the mandate his defiance has generated and by the structural leverage that makes capitulation politically fatal, responds in kind. The loop continues with each iteration, making the resolution harder and the economic damage more concrete. This is not war, let's be precise about that, but it is a sustained rupture in the North American economic and security relationship, and the downstream costs of that rupture, measured over 2 to 5 years, are substantial enough to qualify as a genuine civilizational setback for both countries. Here is your zoom-out moment for the closing. The story of what just happened between Trump and Carney is not just a story about two men, or even about two countries. It is a stress test of the entire post-World War II assumption that the strongest nations in the democratic world have a foundational interest in not using military language against one another, that the fortress of liberal alliance is maintained not by firepower, but by the shared calculation that everyone inside the walls is better off with the walls standing. That assumption is now being tested with more intensity than it has been in a generation. Whether the walls hold depends not on the next press conference, but on the next 3 months of decisions made in rooms that cameras cannot access by people whose names most of us will never learn. The strong takeaway is this. When the most stable bilateral relationship in the world starts using the language of force, nothing downstream stays the same. Not prices, not jobs, not alliances, not the security architecture that 80 years of institutional patience built from rubble. Mark Carney understood something in that moment at the podium that the White House apparently did not. That a central banker who has stared down a financial collapse does not blink when someone raises their voice. And that calm, structural, immovable refusal to accept the frame of coercion may have just become the most consequential diplomatic act of this decade. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is not over. In fact, it is barely in its second chapter. The next update is coming, and when it does, I am going to show you exactly what happens when Scenario B starts moving from theory to infrastructure, because the signals are already there for those watching closely enough. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Carney's response was a historic turning point that permanently reshapes the Canada-US relationship? Or do you think this gets quietly resolved behind closed doors in the next 30 days, like every confrontation before it? Make your case below, because the answer to that question is going to determine everything that follows. Stay informed.